War and the State. Part 2. Types of State. Costs of War. War, then, is not a matter of individual violence writ large. It takes a state of some kind to make a war. But wars also make states. The causation is reciprocal. The machinery of the modern state, writes Porter, is derived historically from the organizational demands of warfare, and states, as we know them today, trace their origins and development in large measure to the crucible of past wars. It may be objected that war, or at least intergroup violence, has been a constant factor of human society since time immemorial, so that to tie it to the emergence of the state is, to put it mildly, counterintuitive. On the contrary, Mary Calder writes, the notion of war as state activity was firmly established only towards the end of the 18th century. The Romans did indeed fight as a state, or a protostate, but their opponents were not other states, but whole societies. So too, the struggles between the Greek city-states were between the citizens of those city-states, and the armies were composed of citizen militias. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, there was of course much fighting, but again not between states as such. Armies as we now know them, with their regiments, their ranks, their barracks, and so on, are of relatively recent origin. The regiment, notes Keegan, was a device for securing the control of armed forces to the state. In earlier times, armies were raised by individual lords when needed, and their loyalty, such as it was to those lords. Keegan again. Attempts to make armed forces more effective by conceding greater independence to landholders in the worst trouble areas, or paying knights to serve under arms, only heightened the problem. The landholders declined to muster when called, built stronger castles, raised private armies, waged war in their own right, sometimes against the sovereigns. Porter takes the view that if the state is to be conceived of as a sovereign power exercising a monopoly of force over a specific geographical area and the population contained therein, then the state simply did not exist in the medieval world. The state, as we know it, is a relatively recent invention, originating in Europe between 1450 and 1650. Since its emergence during this period, the state has taken on a variety of forms. First, there was the quasi-dynastic state with roots in its medieval past, but more significantly with limited sovereignty, even if this was coupled with unlimited ambition. The European state was no more than a private dynasty, no more than a cluster of feudal realms, but it was not yet widely perceived as the political incarnation of a sovereign people. Second, we see the emergence of the nation-state, erupting in the French Revolution and dominating the 19th century. Here, for the first time, we see the attempted identification of the nation, a cultural entity, with the state, a political entity. Originating in war and propagated by invading armies, this nationalism transformed dynastic states into true nation-states. Multinational empires split into a host of new states, and wars of national unification welded disparate principalities into unitary states. This period essentially ended after the First World War, which precipitated the final disintegration of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, created a boomlet of new nation-states on the periphery of Europe. Third, we see the emergence of the collectivist state in the 20th century. This state is characterized by the mass participation of its citizens in its politics, at least in principle, but even more significantly, the extension of the state's remit to the control of the economy and to the provision of welfare for all its citizens. The dynastic state from 1648 to 1789 was, in part, a product of the 30 Years' War. The nation-state was a product of the French Revolutionary Wars and their aftermath. And the collectivist state was a product of the World War I and World War II. The nature of war and the manner of its conduct is intimately connected to the emergence of the various types of state. Calder notes, what we tend to perceive as war, what policymakers and military leaders define as war is in fact a specific phenomenon which took shape in Europe somewhere between the 15th and 18th centuries. It was a phenomenon that was intimately bound up with the evolution of the modern state. In the 17th and 18th centuries, war was a conflict between absolutist states, concerning itself with settling dynastic disputes and border conflicts. The combatants were professional armies, sometimes mercenary, and the wars were financed by taxation and borrowing. In the 19th century, war was a conflict between the newly emerging nation-states. This time, the disputes did not concern dynastic succession or border arrangements, but national goals. The combatants were professional, but also conscripts, and in addition to the normal taxation required to fund the war, we also saw the rapid expansion of bureaucracy and administration. The early 20th century gave us the phenomenon of the World War, or war between coalitions of states, or states comprised of multiple nations or empires. The issue at stake here was the triumph of various ideologies. The armies were again professional, conscript, and massive. The whole economy was mobilized to support the war: tax, bureaucracy, and property confiscation. The mid to late 20th century saw conflict between blocs. Again, the conflict was ideological. The armies were no longer mass conscript, but increasingly technologically sophisticated and professional. The war was again supported by the usual fiscal measures, but also saw the emergence of a symbiotic alliance between the military establishment and the industries supplying the technology. During the entire modern period, war demanded a centralized, rationalized, hierarchically ordered, territorialized modern state. The general condition for modern war, especially the two great wars of the 20th century, is to be found in the modern sovereign state. This state regards itself as the supreme and ultimate form of human society, subject to no law of man, and only subject to the laws of God, insomuch as in time of danger or war each sovereign state claimed or sought a monopoly of divine favour. Given the nature of sovereignty, as that is understood to be characteristic of the modern state, should unresolvable disputes arise between them, no recourse could be had to anything other than brute force. War tends to promote territorial enlargement and integration. Europe went from having approximately 1,000 political units of various kinds in the 1300s to approximately 25 in 1900. War tends to encourage warring factions within the state to submerge their differences. War tends to centralize power and promote the emergence and enlargement of bureaucracies. War invariably increases the government's fiscal depredations upon its own population in the form of taxes, confiscations, conscriptions, or massive borrowings to be set against future tax income. As Porter notes, few states are able to sustain wars out of current revenue alone. Wars almost invariably add to the public debt. Historically, a vast portion of the public debt of European countries has accumulated during wartime. The increases in centralization, taxation, bureaucracy never return to pre-war levels, but ratchet up to new levels. War tends to promote the cult of the great leader. Given the close linkage between war and state formation, it can hardly be regarded as coincidental that both the Puritan Revolution in England and the Secular Revolution in France culminated in military rule. One made a general Lord Protector, the other an emperor. Napoleon was responsible for the complete rationalization and centralization of power in France by means of the dismemberment of the Pays d'État and the creation of départements, the establishment of the Ministries of the Interior and the Ministry of Police, the first to regulate pretty much all activities in France: commerce, transport, education, scientific establishments, the second to censor, carry out surveillance, and control movement by means of identity cards and passports, the latter device still with us. The multiple local legal codes, some 400 of them, were swept away in the Code Napoleon, a uniform body of law applicable to all. Napoleon the General restructured France in the image of a well-organized army. Napoleon's enduring bequest to France was his forging of a centralized nation-state infused with a secular spirit, substantially divested of traditional impediment to state power, and possessed of a uniform system of administration and laws, writes Porter. War tends to promote internal repression. In one of his more lucid moments, Rousseau saw that the waging of interstate wars required the establishment of increasing methods of internal state organization. He wrote, "The whole life of kings, or of those on whom they shuffle off their duties, is devoted solely to two objects: to extend their rule beyond their frontiers, and to make it more absolute within them. Any other purpose they may have is either subservient to one of these aims, or merely a pretext for attaining them. Such pretexts are the good of the community, the happiness of their subjects, or the glory of the nation, phrases forever banished from the council chamber, and employed so clumsily in proclamations that they are always taken as warnings of coming misery, and that the people groans with apprehension when its masters speak to it of their fatherly solicitude. War and conquest without, and the encroachments of despotism within, give each other mutual support." Rousseau noted that money and men are habitually taken at pleasure from a people of slaves to bring others beneath the same yoke, and that conversely war furnishes a pretext for exaction of money, and another, no less plausible, for keeping large armies constantly on foot to hold people in awe. In a word, anyone can see that aggressive princes wage war at least as much on their subjects as on their enemies, and that the conquering nation is left no better off than the conquered. The human suffering and physical devastation are obvious enough consequences of war, though not so obvious as to prevent its constant recurrence. What is not so often noted is the staggering financial cost of war, resulting not only from the damage and destruction of property which has to be replaced, but from the finance needed to pay, transport, and supply the soldiers who are to partake in this unique form of social interaction. Porter notes that one factor in the collapse of laissez-faire during World War I was the enormous cost of the war, which dwarfed all previous European conflicts in the magnitude of resources required for its waging. The result was an extremely robust fiscal military cycle of bureaucratic expansion, centralization, and increased taxation. The percentage of national income devoted to military spending in all the major powers rose on the average from slightly over 4% to between 25 and 33% over the course of the war. In earlier and more innocent times, the extraordinary revenues granted to the king in time of war, purportedly for the provision of defence against external aggression, were intended to be once-off subsidies subject to parliamentary approval. When such approval was not forthcoming, government used financial expedients, forced loans, borrowing from foreign bankers, currency debasement, and the sale of assets. War taxes were temporary and conditional. Kings, of course, wanted them to be permanent and unconditional. The solution? Let war be perpetual. In France, by the middle of the 15th century, given the state of almost perpetual war in which the country found itself, extraordinary taxes had become ordinary. In England, in contrast, the exaction of extraordinary royal taxes did not escape the watchful eye of Parliament. It is one of history's ironies that when Parliament succeeded in the 17th century struggle between King and Commons, it would give rise to a situation in which the new national executive would be drawn from the ranks of Parliament, so that there was no longer any real distinction between the tax seekers and the tax approvers, and so no possibility of resistance to extraordinary ordinary taxation. Francis Fukuyama writes, "One of the glorious revolution's main accomplishments was to make taxation legitimate, because it was henceforth clearly based on consent." Well, not exactly. What the Glorious Revolution did was to create a Pooh-Bah-esque situation in which any real distinction between the executive power that demanded taxes and the body which was supposed to represent the interests of the taxpayers was eliminated, thus making effective opposition to taxes practically impossible. In the end, however, the ever-increasing costs of war steadily eroded the distinction between the extraordinary and the ordinary, not just in England, but more or less everywhere in Europe. Ames and Rapp note that the transition from feudal levies to professional armies, connected with the displacement of cavalry and its replacement with massed infantry, required substantial financial support. The birth of tax systems in Western Europe is tied to this military transition. Modern taxation supplanted feudal dues in part because of the need for liquid funds to pay modern standing armies. Fukuyama notes that the bulk of the budgets of early modern states went on military expenses. 90% of the budget of the Dutch Republic was spent on war in the period of their long struggle with the Spanish king. 98% of the Habsburg Empire's budget went to finance its wars with Turkey and the Protestant powers in the 17th century. From the beginning of the 17th century to its end, the budget of France rose 5 to 8-fold, while the British budget increased 16-fold from 1590 to 1670. The size of the French army increased proportionally from 12,000 men in the 13th century to 50,000 in the 16th, to 150,000 in the 1630s, to 400,000 in Louis XIV's reign. The case of Philip IV of France is exemplary in this regard. Philip sought to bring the quasi-independent fiefs of Gascony in the far southwest and Flanders in the far northeast under his control. To fund this expensive undertaking, he had recourse to a number of inventive financial expedients. The clergy were compelled to vote supplies. From 1294, the laity were gathered together to vote aids. In 1294, an indirect sales tax was introduced. In addition, the king persecuted the Templars and the Jews, whose assets he confiscated, and he sought immediate relief by debasing the coinage and by borrowing freely from Italian bankers, later repudiating his debts. Nothing, it would seem, changes. Modern governments seem to have taken King Philip's correspondence course. By the end of the 17th century, the king was no longer first among equals, but preeminent over all. The ability of the nobility to be a counterforce to the monarch had more or less vanished for good, as they were transformed from quasi-independent mini-monarchs to courtiers dancing attendance on the king. The Reformation had effectively eliminated the Church's power to be an alternative source of authority. In Protestant states, the Church became, in effect, a government department, and even in Catholic countries, it came under increasing de facto state control. In no Protestant country did the Church provide a truly effective obstacle to state control. In the main, its authority and privileges were not such as to incur the opposition of secular powers, nor did it feel the uncomfortable blast of the impious Enlightenment, except perhaps in Scotland, writes Houghton. At the nascent stage of state formation, kings had to recruit their forces from the contributions of semi-independent feudal barons. But as the modern state took shape, monarchs were able to consolidate territorial borders and to centralize power by using their growing economic assets derived from customs duties, various forms of taxation, and borrowing from the emergent bourgeoisie to raise mercenary armies, which gave them a certain degree of independence from the barons. Perhaps the significant, or at least one of the most significant moves, was the move from baronial levies and mercenary troops to the creation of a standing army, permanently at the disposal of the monarch, garrisoned in barracks and drilled into obedience. The establishment of standing armies under the control of the state was an integral part of the monopolization of legitimate violence, which was intrinsic to the modern state, writes Calder. Standing armies are expensive. To keep a lot of men hanging about in barracks, engaged in non-productive activities, to house, feed and pay them, takes a lot of money. In the 18th century, almost all of the state's revenues went towards paying for this army. The average would seem to have been around 75% or so. New bureaucracies emerged to make tax gathering more efficient. If money was to be borrowed, banking had to be regularized, this to include the creation of central banks and a distinction drawn between the personal finances of the monarch and the state's finances. The making of the modern state and the making of war go hand in hand, and money, other people's money, lots of it, is required for both. Towns everywhere housed bureaucrats, great and small, who existed above all to tax, to police, and to regulate society, writes Houghton. the king no longer lived off his own, but increasingly from his ability to extract resources from a defined territory. It was no longer possible for a kingdom to be administered personally by a king and his closest advisors. Expansive administrative apparatuses, modelled on those pioneered by the Church as early as the 11th century, were established, and the tentacles of the state began to spread, with an attempt to homogenize language, laws, and customs through the various kingdoms. To set up such complex structures requires the cooperation of those groups in society which possess the resources necessary for infrastructural expansion, namely administrative, financial, and military expertise, ready cash, and the personal authority associated with social standing. These groups in turn seek to negotiate or extract terms of service that will protect and/or extend their privileges, status, and income in the face of the potentially unlimited and arbitrary authority of the patrimonial monarch or prince. Remarking on the expansion in the size of bureaucracies, Anthony de Jesse writes, "It has been estimated that over the period from 1850 to 1890, the number of British government employees grew by about 100%, and from 1890 to 1950 by another 1,000%. Commensurate with the expansion in size was the expansion in budget. Public expenditure in the 19th century averaged about 13% of GNP. After 1920, it never fell below 24%. After 1946, it was never less than 36%. And in our day, it is, of course, just below or just above the halfway mark, depending on how we count public expenditure." Alwyn Houghton concurs, remarking that armies require massive bureaucracies to sustain them, and that the work of government was directed above all to ensuring the revenues needed to keep them up and indeed extend them. She notes, as we have seen Tilley, Ertmann, and others note, that the cost of servicing the debts incurred to pay for the armies and navies were the really significant elements in a state's expenditure, compared to which, in the early days at least, the state's expenditures on all other items paled into insignificance. Strife between states involves each state in aggression against its own citizens by confiscation, tax, inflation, property destruction, and so on, enslavement, draft, conscription, injury, and death. Among these varied forms of internal aggression, taxation could only be efficiently gathered if the internal structure of each state was stable and the means of exercising violence limited to the state and its officials. The establishment of law, order, justice within the state provided a stable platform for taxation and borrowing and for legitimacy. In the 18th century, wars were fought with one eye on cost, so that battles were avoided if at all possible. Manoeuvring, retreats, and advances were substituted, and armies wintered while fighting was suspended. That all changed with the Napoleonic mass levies. Human life was cheap in a conscript army. If you lost 50,000 men, there were always another 50,000 men to replace them. The Napoleonic model went into abeyance for most of the 19th century, only to reappear with a vengeance in the 20th. The wars of the first half of the 20th century were total wars, involving not just a professional military force financed by heavy taxation and massive borrowing, although it did all that, but also involved the entire civilian population to provide men and material. All the resources of the nation were directed towards the war. Economic enterprises became targets. Indiscriminate bombing of civilians was justified to destroy enemy morale. It is said that as a rule what goes up must come down, but taxes are a depressing exception to this rule. Even when war taxes are lowered eventually, they rarely if ever return to their pre-war level. In the USA, the introduction of income tax on a regular basis required the passage of the 16th Amendment to the Constitution in 1913. In a 40-year period, the French had rejected some 200 bills that attempted to introduce income tax. Income tax was introduced for the first time in July 1914. The dates for the American and French acceptance of income tax are significant. Even with the stupendous rise in taxes in the countries at war, the income was not sufficient to pay for the war. The rest of the money was borrowed. Spend today, pay tomorrow. which meant that tax rates would stay high for years after the conclusion of the war. In the British case, just servicing the war debt required an annual post-war expenditure equivalent to 175% of the entire national budget in 1913, writes Porter.